Good evening. My name is Sophia Lems. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Riga International Biennial of Contemporary Art and Suddenly It All Blossoms, curated by Rebecca Larmarche-Vadel. It is my pleasure welcoming you to the fifth convergence of our online series of talks and conversations this week under the banner of the glossary word healing. One of every 5 plants in the world are at risk of extinction. Since the 1900s, nearly 3 species of seed-bearing plants have disappeared per year, 500 times faster than they would naturally, scientists say. Plant disappearance can lead to a cascade of extinctions in other organisms that rely on them, of course. For instance, insects who use plants for food or for laying their eggs, leading to dramatic shifts in the Earth's ecosystems. Contrary to vegetal life, whose existence is premised on the constant articulation with their surroundings, Western modernity, with its colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist projects, has brought us to a moment in time where we're no longer surrounded by a lush forest, but rather by the unfiltered, unabated light of global capital, casted by worldwide deforestation. Landscape and vegetation are the backdrop against which dispossession is mobilized by intensive agriculture, industrial farming, and settler colonialism, which have contaminated, exhausted, scorched, and flooded the surface of our planet. Our speaker this evening, however, believes that in being with plants, everything slows down to the pace of their growth. The philosopher Michael Marder finds himself in a communion with everything they are and live with, and it is in this slowdown, Michael writes, that another cultivation of life is realized. What does it mean then to spend time with nature rather than in nature? This evening, Michael will be addressing the cosmogony, that is, the study of the origin of the cosmos, of Hildegard of Bingen, also known as Saint Hildegard, a 12th century German Benedictine abbess, writer, composer, philosopher, Christian mystic, visionary, and polymath, considered by many to be the founder of the European scientific natural history. Hildegard wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal texts, as well as letters, liturgical songs for women, choirs, and poems, one of which introduces Michael's reflections on her scientific, spiritual, and medicinal writings tonight. I'll start by introducing Michael, to whom I'm very grateful for the many inspiring conversations over the years. And so Michael is a philosopher based in Lisbon, whose work has focused on cultivating philosophies that take into account and derive from vegetal life, proposing new models for understanding the complex relationships between humans and the apparent inertia of plants. His work spans the fields of environmental philosophy, of ecological thought, political theory, and phenomenology, addressing how plants think, are thinking about plants, and the dynamic interaction between the two. Michael often collaborates with artists, plant biologists, and other philosophers, most notably with the French feminist philosopher and psychoanalyst Lucie de Garay, whose correspondence can be read in the wonderful book Through Vegetal Being from 2016. Michael has published various articles, most of which are available for free download in his website, and monographs, including Plant Thinking, A Philosophy of Vegetal Life, from 2013, which is one of the first books, I believe, to inaugurate the vegetal turn in contemporary art, but also The Philosopher's Plant, an Intellectual Herbarium, Grafts, Writing on Plants, and forthcoming this year, Dumb Philosophy, A Phenomenology of Devastation, among others. He is Irke Basque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country. Without further ado, Michael, thank you for connecting with us.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It's a pleasure to be sharing some of my recent work with the audience at Riga Biennale. And the title of my talk today is To Heal a Shipwrecked World, St. Hildegard Cures. Now, in one of the poems gathered in Symphonia, St. Hildegard of Bingen realizes with pained lucidity that her world, like that of St. Rupert, to whom the poem is dedicated, and to a still greater extent our own world, is a shipwrecked world, naufragus mundus. In contrast to St. Rupert, who abandons it, and whom she does not rebuke for this desertion, she feels the urge to rescue and heal it. A broken world consists of broken bodies and broken souls, the connections between and among them torn. Beyond her medicinal practice, the healing impulse responding to and assuming responsibility for this predicament is present in all of Hildegard's endeavors and interpretations, from music to a reading of Christian theology, from a concern with the declining power of creaturely self-regeneration to the role of women and of plants in pointing a path to the recovery of this power. We will come back to Hildegard's recipes for mending these ties in conversation with Sophia, but immediately a pair of questions crops up. What can we learn about the current environmental crisis from texts by a 12th century Benedictine abbess? And why combine ecology and theology at all? Now, I think that the answer to the second question actually holds a clue to the first. Theology and ecology are codes for mental, psychic, spiritual, and material extended embodied relations, respectively. They are articulation in vitality by means of viriditas, literally the green in green, referring to the self-refreshing or self-regenerating capacity of finite existence. So their articulation in vitality by means of this power of viriditas has the potential to heal the split, which was only exacerbated by Descartes, but by no means introduced by him, the split responsible for putting the planet on the brink of an environmental disaster. The ontotheological metaphysical tradition, already palpable in Pauline Christianity, in the works of the Gnostics and in Neoplatonism, has treated existence here below as infinitely less valuable and stable than the true reality of spirit. As a result, the destruction of this world, which from a metaphysical standpoint is mere fog or a veil before our eyes, is viewed as nothing terrible. On the contrary, the world's coming to an end is supposed to celebrate the final victory of truth and virtue over falsehood and sin. As it is as a consequence of secularizing this logic and its economic ramifications that the planet has been transformed into a dump for industrial activities of Western societies. The ecological nightmare we're living or dying in today is a hardly disguised cumulative outcome of the ideas and practices that have shaped the dominant Western theological tradition for millennia. Now, though embedded in this tradition, Hildegard articulates ecology and theology otherwise, in an endeavor that is not at all outdated, insofar as it occupies itself with the roots of today's environmental disaster. As she imbues ecological relations with theological meaning and suffuses theology with ecological, largely vegetal connotations, Hildegard intimates that the abuse of the earth and its issue, the abuse of the sky, of water, of animals, and even minerals, is not qualitatively different from the ill treatment of everything and everyone that is holy in Judeo-Christianity, in her reading of Judeo-Christianity. The associations she foregrounds go beyond St. Augustine's allegorical symbolism. Physics and physiology express the truth of spirit, while something of spirit is manifest in the most mundane of phenomena, in the simplest of things. Ever a physician, Hildegard proposes an eco-theological cure to the eco-theological disorder that is the rift between matter and spirit. Crucially for Hildegard, the drama of sin and salvation is played out between the environmental poles of the forest and the desert. The revitalizing power of viriditas, which I have already mentioned, on the one hand, and the deadly force of ariditas on the other. Its dry, scorching heat eerily anticipating anthropogenic global warming and the threat of mass extinction due to catastrophic climate change. On the one hand, the contrast between eternal and ephemeral being softens under the influence of viriditas that inflects life with a potentially infinite thrust of self-regeneration. On the other, ariditas hardens the divides between the body and the soul, matter and spirit, the ensouled body and its environment. It deprives life of the conditions necessary for living on, separates the living from life, exhausts life itself. Described in this fashion, ariditas is indistinguishable from metaphysics and traditional theology. As for our, presumably post-metaphysical, secular age, in addition to her invocation of the shipwrecked world, Hildegard portrays it perfectly in the fifth vision included in Book 2 of her Scivias. Here, God decries unbridled human mastery and control over creation. And I quote, these are the words of God as relayed by Hildegard in her vision. I had a green field in my power. Did I give it to you, O human, so that you would make it put forth whatever fruit you wished? Unquote. Having dared touch not so much the green field itself as that which makes it green, having meddled with a power, the potestas, that is not theirs, human beings produce a strange effect that is neither dry nor fresh, and, in Hildegard's words, a world that is neither dead nor alive. Today's predominant growth, the desert's self-reproduction on an expanding scale, matches Hildegard's vision. But it is not only the earth that is becoming a desert. The world, too, is desertified, the realms of matter and spirit converging on their mutual destitution. What does the end of the world look like for a world that neither dead nor alive is in itself, in its very modus operandi, as scurrying to the end of itself and of the earth? And what does the activity of healing, of making whole again, or, for the first time, what does such an activity look like in such a world? Together with Sophia, I want to tease out 3 curative threads from Hildegard's body of work in response to these questions. These threads include the vegetalization, the feminization, and the musicalization of existence. Very often, these threads will intertwine with one another, but it's important to keep them minimally separate so as to make them intelligible. So I think we will begin with vegetalization then.
Thank you, Michael, for this wonderful introduction. So you describe viriditas as a pulsating, vital force akin to vegetal life. How is this concept articulated in Hildegard's eco-theology?
Well, this is actually one of the main contributions of Hildegard to theology and to, I think, thinking in general. It's one of the organizing terms in Hildegard's thought. By viriditas, she refers to the self-refreshing power of finite creation, its capacity to recreate itself, so that after the initial creative act, God withdraws from the picture and creation is capable of renewing itself, of giving birth to the future, as it were, to its own future. What I find remarkable is that the color green is very much prominent in the concept of viriditas. And therefore plants with their self-regenerative capacity are at the forefront of this concept. But viriditas refers at the same time to what is colored, green, and what is not a color, to plants and to all other existences that have this capacity to self-regenerate. Now, interestingly, Hildegard also transposes these vegetal images guided by the sense of viriditas onto Christian theology. So she imagines the Virgin Mary in the shape of what she calls the greenest branch, and she refers to Mary not as gratia plena, full of grace, but as viriditate plena, full of viriditas. Or perhaps more accurately, she would say that Mary is full of grace insofar as she is full of viriditas. Then starting from this point of vegetalizing even theological figures, of thinking of this vegetal power that is not only included in plants but is also common to everything that lives, we can start also contemplating our own human condition in relation to viriditas, to what happens to viriditas in the human who obviously does not have chlorophyll and does not participate in the visible colored aspect of greenness, but is supposed to live on and to perpetuate existence thanks to the same capacity, the same power that Hildegard locates in plants and even in theological figures.
Right, and of course, much of your work has been about a relentless uprooting from this world. So, did human life actively depart from viriditas?
Yes, I would say human life has departed actively from Viriditas, and that would be Hildegard's reading of the original sin, for instance. It all starts with this initial action by Adam and Eve of eating the fruit from the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But I would say that it is actually impossible to depart from Viriditas. If anything, in the human, in this fallen condition of humanity, and we will have a chance, I think, to also think fallenness and sinfulness in Hildegard's terms, which are not at all moralistic, but in fact touch very closely on what we consider to be environmental crimes and the whole environmental crisis that can be read in terms of this kind of ontological notion of sin in Hildegard. I think that it is impossible to depart from Viriditas because then life itself would end. Rather, what happened in the human condition is something very weird, which is that Viriditas has parted against itself. It has been pitted against itself. So with the human in this fallen condition, life itself is divided against life. And this is the tragic kind of happening that Hildegard tries to contend with throughout her theology. It turns out that the human, not as created by God, but as created through the original sin, that gives the human its kind of earthly fallen form, the human is this formative wound, where the shortcoming, the fallenness, the defect is not just a deviation from a perfect condition before the fall, but rather becomes definitive of what it is to be human. And so here in fallenness and sinfulness, there are no moralistic overtones at all in Hildegard. Rather, what we find is a kind of emergence of nihilism, a rebellion against life. Life's own turning against life, as Nietzsche would say. And I think Nietzsche, in that sense, can be perfectly paired with Hildegard. We can perhaps think about the solutions to the current environmental crisis and the global disaster that we're living through based on this kind of a reading of the human as a being with whom nihilism has started very early on, from the very inception of humanity, and the turning of Viriditas against itself in the figure that we call the human.
And do you find in the work of Hildegard anything that leads to a sort of treatment from our alienation from the actual greenness of the plant world?
Yes, I think that, as I mentioned in the introduction, the whole of Hildegard's work is a series of prescriptions or a series of recipes for dealing with this condition. And not the least, her reading of Christian theology is a reading of an attempt to cure this turning against Viriditas. So she will think of, for instance, not only of the Virgin Mary as the greenest branch, but also of Jesus as the brilliant flower that blossoms on this branch. Again, vegetalizing these theological figures, but also proposing them as a kind of substitute or as a recipe or as a replacement for Adam and Eve with their fallenness. So Jesus is this new Adam who redeems existence, who redeems the original sin. In other words, who tries to remake the human not as this wound, as this formative wound of an identity that has turned life against life itself, but rather who attunes us to the complexities of living, to the symphonicity, as Hildegard herself would say, of life. But there are two specific cures that Hildegard proposes with regard to the vegetal instantiation of the original sin, because obviously eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is reveling in a fruit, right? And very often Hildegard will prioritize these plant parts like branches, leaves, and flowers that precede the fruit, and would try to cut off, as it were, this fruit that is always ready to fall, that is, even when it's ripe, is already on the verge of decaying. She will try to cut it off from what is determinative of human existence. And so this first vegetal cure, I call it cutting the cut. So that assuming that the forbidden fruit is the material cause of sin, responsible for the castration of humanity, the mission of Holy Spirit, according to Hildegard, is to cut it loose from the tree. And I can quote from Symphonia, from her poetic work, where she says about the Holy Spirit, "But you hold the sword ever ready to cut off what the poisoned apple brings forth through the darkest homicide," right? And so the idea is that this negative element that becomes formative in human identity will need to be itself negated for something positive to blossom here. I'm of course reading a little bit of Hegel into this. Cutting the cut is a kind of very embodied shape of thinking about the negation of the negation in Hegel. And then the second major recipe for a cure in the vegetal sense is discovering plenitude in the perceived lack. And this, by the way, is something that can apply to the Western metaphysical view of plant life in general. Plant life has always been framed as lacking something, as lacking in sensation, as lacking even in ensoulment or the soul. It is a living that is living on, according to the metaphysical tradition, without any recognizable features of what makes life alive, right? Apparently without movement, even though that is not true, right? So the idea, I think, that Hildegard is taking here is that this perceived lack can be a site where we can discover plenitude. And what happens is that Hildegard is methodologically, but also intuitively, as it were, shifting the center of gravity in power relations so as to address the imbalance within the vir of viriditas, between virginity and virility, right? Because she plays, throughout her work, she plays with this Latin root vir, which is obviously there at the root of viriditas, which implies power. There's a very complex knot that ties it to power, to virtue, to virility or masculinity, but also to virginity, right? So the whole issue of sexual difference enters the fray here, and we will touch upon this in a moment as well. But in the absence of fruits that have been cut from this new flourishing and new blossoming of existence with the figures of Mary and Jesus, her efforts actually involve the opposite of gravity, the gravity that makes the fruit fall, a corporeal elevation of vegetal growth. So she will, if she wants to re-spiritualize existence, then she's not going to appeal to some realities beyond the earth, somewhere in heavens. Rather, she sees in plant growth already a material figure of spiritualization because it moves against gravity, right? This growing, the very coming of the seedling out of the earth and growing up, and then the opening of the flower as well, is a kind of movement contra natura, within natura, against nature, within nature, and becomes symbolic of spirit itself. And the branch, obviously, which is Mary, this greenest branch, is a mobile support lifting other plant parts, but also birds, insects, and small animals, while staying in touch with the terrestrial sphere. And this will be Hildegard's preferred figure for spirit. It's an uplifting that at the same time remains rooted in the earth. There is no detachment, there is no cut from earthly existence here. So Mary hoists Jesus. She holds Jesus up as a branch that holds its flower. And Jesus, of course, carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. And then, in that sense, Hildegard calls Mary Virga Mediatrix, the mediating branch, for the blossoming of a beautiful flower who is Jesus. So she becomes the mediator of the mediator. And this emphasis on the middle is very typical of Hildegard's approach, and again bespeaks her commitment to vegetal life, which always finds itself in the middle between various spheres, such as the earth and the sky, which we already mentioned. And the mediatory role of Jesus, for instance, as an intermediate figure between the human and the divine, what in the theological tradition is called theandric, right? Jesus' nature is theandric, human and divine at the same time, is also attributed by Hildegard to Mary, who is a mediatrix, right? She is Virga Mediatrix, this mediating branch, and therefore a mediator for the mediator, which means that she's not a mere receptacle for divine word, right? But she's accomplishing the work of Jesus before Jesus himself does it. She plays his role before he himself does it, and not only her, but John the Baptist does so as well, of course. So there are all kinds of figures who have a mediating role for the mediator, and that gives them a kind of vegetalized image in Hildegard's work and thought.
That reminds me very much of a science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, who wrote an essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, in which she proposes holding as an alternative to the unidirectional, forceful, or shaft-like sort of creation myths. And I was just sort of remembering or recalling my days of Sunday school, which maybe I'll just read out the first lines of the Old Testament from the Christian Biblical Canon and the Hebrew Bible, for those viewers who might not be familiar with them, that say, and I quote, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And I was recalling these lines exactly because it seems that in the place of reading formlessness and command in the creation myth, Hildegard is finding a material opening for gestation, for mutability, for the space of in between, for the process.
Yes, that's certainly true, and indeed Hildegard is almost heretical in that she states that in one of her poems in Symphonia, she states that in the beginning the world was verdant. The world was verdant. So she does not start with a void, in fact, unlike the Hebrew Bible and what is called the Old Testament in the Christian tradition. She begins in the middle, faithful to how plants are, faithful to vegetal life. She begins in the middle with the life as already flourishing, blossoming, though not coming to fruition. So we've seen her refuse the end that is symbolized by the fruit. In the same manner, she refuses a clear-cut beginning as symbolized by nothing vegetal, but precisely by the void that you, Sophia, referred to. This being in the middle, this work of mediation is not only vegetal, but also feminine. And by feminine, I'm not saying that for Hildegard only views it as attributable to women, but in fact to a kind of feminine element in human subjectivity in general, whether of men, women, or any other genders. There are actually, since we're touching now upon this theme of feminization of existence in Hildegard, there are very curious instances, and many of those instances, when Hildegard is very playful with and upsetting all kinds of traditional expectations for gender roles and attributes and so on. So in Symphonia, with regard to the creation of Eve from Adam's rib, she will say, and I quote, "How great is in its power the side of man from which God produced the form of woman." Right? So this apparently discarded and superfluous element without which Adam could perfectly live is the strongest part, is great in power, this side of man, which is no longer his, but which is actually a woman. So she takes this traditional narrative, which seems to subjugate women to men, saying that women actually were derivative from men, and says that Eve emanated from the strongest part of Adam, the strongest side of Adam. And she will say the same about Mary, the greenest branch, when she appeals to her and says in Symphonia, also in a poem, "Oh, the sweetest branch, what a great power this is." So this association of womanhood with power is very prominent here. Not to mention that Jesus himself is figured as a brilliant flower. Again, at least in the modern understanding, flowery kind of images are associated with womanhood, as opposed to a male figure whom Hildegard associates with a flower, as opposed to the greenest branch, which is Mary. But speaking about this question that you raised, Sophia, of gestation and giving birth, I think that what Hildegard does is she points at the mutual gestation of man and a woman, at least in the creation narrative. So there is a vegetal aspect to Eve's growing out from Adam's side. As Hildegard says, Eve was formed from a rib by Adam's implanted heat and moistness. So this implanted heat and moistness are pointing at a vegetal kind of generation of Eve. And at the same time, Hildegard is also drawing our attention to the fact that while a woman gestates in a man, in this case, a man is also created from a woman. So she says a woman is created from a man and a man is made from a woman. And obviously, starting from Eve, women give birth to men as well as to women. But despite that unique origin of Adam, Adam is made out of the earth by God and does not have a mother. Adam himself is also not exempt from this axiomatic making of a man from a woman. He becomes a man retrospectively, only following the creation of Eve, right? And so even Adam is under the sway of this mutual gestation, that each gives the birth to the other. Each mediates the other to become who or what he or she is, right? So this is the idea here.
I very much enjoy this idea of mutual gestation as a segue for thinking about identity as something relational, and focusing on this moment of suspension before the distribution of the world, like, along gendered lines. Does Hildegard account for gender identity further in her work?
Yes, I think she is very mindful, first of all, of her own position as a woman writer or as a woman preacher at this time when this was obviously not common at all. And her strategy, because there are various levels here that we can talk about. There's the strategic level and the more ontological level. Strategically, she always emphasizes the fact in her letters, in her discourses, even in her visions, she emphasizes the fact that she's but a poor, illiterate woman, which obviously gives even more force and power to what she says. She's not claiming to be some magnificent earthly authority. She is pointing out her gender, her own gender identity, as a site of a lack of privilege, of deprivation even. Which is why she says, "I'm but a poor little woman who has been given access miraculously to these visions of God and who has become an instrument for this." Now, at the more ontological level, there is obviously a lot of playfulness, as I have already suggested, and transgressivity even about gender identities and expected gender roles in Hildegard. What happens here are these delightful transgressions whereby we see the feminization of the masculine and the masculization of the feminine, right? So feminizing the masculine, how so? Because living as such is gestating with the other, an experience that already Adam was acquainted with, right? So there is no way of living or continuing to live without a gestation with the other. And that feminizes even masculinity. And on the contrary, masculinizing the feminine because a certain vegetal power, as embodied in Mary the Greenest Branch, is what is proper to femininity, right? And so these two levels, the strategic level and the ontological level, converge on the problem of justice, that, or rather injustice, that Hildegard wants to address, because she's very critical of what happens in her age, and she even says in one of her letters that the justice of God is weak. The justice of God is weak, specifically in that historical epoch when she's writing, and because of this, Hildegard calls this era when the justice of God is weak womanly times, tempus muliebre, right? And so again, there is a kind of, she plays to the hand of her audience, which are the prelates at Mainz, who have imposed the prohibition of liturgical musical services at her abbey as a punishment for burying a heretic on in the churchyard of the abbey. And so she's playing to her audience, saying the justice of God is weakened at this time, and these are womanly times. But instead of thinking about womanly times as the weak times, what she finally presents in that very letter is that the woman is not a symptom of epochal malaise, but a cure. It's not a symptom, but a cure. When the justice of God is weak, when the time are womanly, women need to step in and step up to fortify the justice of God. So womanly times are also the times for women to actually act, and Hildegard seizes upon that precise moment. And this is what, confirming this kind of reading that I'm proposing, this is what she writes in this extended letter to the prelates at Mainz. When the strength of divine justice evaporates, a female warrior struggles with injustice so that it may be defeated. Right? And the female warrior, so Bellatrix is the word she uses. It's specifically a feminine form of a warrior, and she definitely identifies with such a figure.
You've alluded before to a sense of musicality in Hildegard's work. We know that she wrote extensively on music and sound, and I was wondering if you could tell us about how ideas of the sonic manifest in her work and in her cosmogony.
Yes, definitely. So obviously Hildegard did not only write music, she also wrote on music. She did both, and this letter from which I cited just now is her most extensive piece of writing on what music is for her. And for her, music was not just instrumental arrangements, even though those were important. They were not just the instrumental arrangements that we're familiar with, but also and especially an ontological existential arrangement. So very famously, she says that the soul is symphonic, which means that the soul, if we take this the literal sense of symphonia, that means sounding with. And it means that the soul as symphonic is already a complex arrangement. There is no unity, undivided unity in it. Rather, there are different sounds and pitches and tonalities coming together to form what is called the soul. And taking earlier thinkers into account, starting with Aristotle, we could say that the vegetal, animal, and human aspects of a soul gather together or come together into this symphonicity of the soul itself. And then also the relationality of the soul, that there is no soul without a relation to the other, be it the divine other or other souls or even the body itself. So one can think with Hildegard the very connection of the soul and the body as a symphonic connection as well. The soul sounds the body while it also sounds with the body in the symphonic arrangement, right? And on top of this, and this gives us a kind of an entry point into the ecological signification of the symphonicity of the soul, the symphonicity of its relation to the body, there is no reason to believe that the sounding of the soul is exclusively human. Other bodies and souls, not least those of plants, also participate in the symphony of singing praises to the divine, as Hildegard puts it, after their own manner. right? With living voices that might be foreign to the human template of vitality and to the human template of what voicing actually means. And yet there is a kind of that's why I would call it a kind of symphony in green emerging here. That is the sounding or the co-sounding of all of existence together in these symphonic arrangements that are at once embodied and ensouled in this sense.
And I suppose that with relation to what you've mentioned earlier, with the plant growing always from the middle, and the idea of this constant self-articulation of with the world, which is, I find, one of the most powerful teachings in your writings. What is the space of resonance? How do we resonate with each other in this co-sounding?
Yes, so this is actually a very important question, because when we think about the symphonicity of existence, we think about harmonies, and obviously this harmoniousness is something that Hildegard herself cherished, but she saw it as a kind of an instrumental music. She saw harmoniousness as a kind of pale trace of how existence was before the fall. When the voices and these connections among and between voices were strong. So again, an ontological reading of the fall and fallenness and the original sin is precisely a muting of existence, a muting down, a breaking of the sounding width of symphonicity, and a kind of cacophony and dissonance that emerges from that. But interestingly enough, Hildegard also acknowledges that we should not simply aspire toward recovering that harmony in music when the world itself is suffering from injustice, when the justice of God is weak, as she puts it. And that makes her absolutely contemporary for a thinker like Adorno, Theodor Adorno, German Jewish critical thinker of the Frankfurt School, who actually, I'm simplifying a little bit, but who said that there is no raison d'être for art that does not express suffering, that does not express the dissonance of the world, the disadjustment or the maladjustment of the world. That has to be reflected in art for art to really live up to its purpose. And Hildegard actually acknowledges this in a very interesting way, because she doesn't think that symphonicity of existence would be complete without what she calls these sighs and tears, and tears of those who are suffering. And it is from, she says, I'm quoting, from these sighs and tears, the powers of Viriditas are recovered. So there is no way to simply leave behind and forget those who, in her words, are groaning tearfully, and to shut our ears to those sighs and groans and moans, and to revel in the harmonies of existence. Rather, if there is a chance for recovering the powers of Viriditas, for curing the world, then all of those expressions, vocal expressions of suffering, have to be accounted for in this symphony of existence.
And would it be correct to assume that there is a healing potential in song?
Yes, definitely. There is a healing potential in song insofar as it reconnects, again, all of those elements that are supposed to be symphonically gathered together and articulated. It gives us also a kind of, again, I mentioned it, this pale image, or a very a diminished version of how existence would be like, or was in pre-lapsarian paradisiac state, according to Hildegard. And it allows for a very concrete way of representation, of actually representation, not as treating someone as an object to be represented, but becoming represented through the voice that one has and that one is actually. Because for Hildegard, it is not only a matter of having a voice, but a matter of being a voice. One is one's voice, and the singing that affirms or that voices itself brings out the the kind of being of existence that has been diminished by the breakage of those ties, those relational ties that make us who we are in connection to others, whether human or not.
I see. Obviously, Hildegard's voice is extremely contemporary. So this question, I suppose, comes in two parts. Firstly, how was her work received then? And secondly, what teachings may we take in from her about the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, first to address the first part of your question, the reception of Hildegard's work at the time was very enthusiastic. So she was probably the first woman to gather crowds all over Europe who came to listen to her preaching. She was the first sort of star lecturer, we would say today, on the European scale, and she had this copious correspondence with abbots and priests, but also even with popes, the leading theologians of the time. In general, Hildegard was lucky that she lived at the time when she lived, because if she were to be born at the time of the Inquisition, about 200 years after her actual birth, she would definitely have been burnt at the stake for being a heretic or a witch, for this kind of vegetalization, for instance, of the Christian canon that would have landed her the accusation of being a pagan or a paganist kind of thinker. So that as far as her reception, and obviously she has been sanctified, she is Saint Hildegard, and she is included in the ranks of the doctors of the church, of those who are the learned, even though she, throughout her life, she insisted that she was absolutely illiterate and all of her knowledge was a direct divine inspiration. Now, what we can learn from Hildegard in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic, I would say that there are two things we can learn in relation to the pandemic itself, and then in relation to two more things in relation to our response, our collective response to the pandemic. First, what we learn is obviously the unfeasibility of separating ourselves from the outside. We learn about our exposure also through our breathing to the world, right, in relation to the virus. We learn about this vulnerability, which is also happening at the site of a relational strength. And I think that Hildegard emphasizes always this kind of co-implication or co-imbrication of relational strength and vulnerability, for instance, in the figure of the feminine. Right. This exposure, of course, at the times of the COVID-19 is what we share with plants. And so the whole thrust of the vegetalization of existence, of human and even divine existence by Hildegard acquires its different, if darkly tinged, sense here. Secondly, and relatedly, COVID-19 teaches us in a vegetal key that the processes of what has been called globalization are not only ideal, are not only ideological or purely financial, but material and embodied. And this co-implication again of matter and spirit in Hildegard's work is coming through very clearly now with our movement of what we call globalization. I think before COVID-19, it has been taken as this purely ideal, if not spiritual movement, right? And spirit, of course, I'm saying this tongue in cheek because the spirit nowadays is the spirit of capital. So the whole financial movement of globalization and the flows of capital and money are on the side of pure ideality, just as an ideal spirit detached from the world here below. This is how globalization has been framed and experienced and understood before the pandemic. With the pandemic, I think that the irreducibility of the body, of matter, to globalizing processes has come to the fore, and this is something that Hildegard teaches us. So this material interconnectedness of every part of the globe has been revealed in a negative light, to be sure, by the lightning fast speed with which the virus spread. That the pandemic was possible in such a short period of time obviously highlights this material, also material interconnectedness. It shows that our growths and decays as well are symbiotic with each other. There is no way for, just as there is no way for capital to grow outside of the material and at the expense of the material sphere, so our individual, say, growth and decay is only possible in relation to the growth and decay of others. There is a symbiosis between our growths and decays and that of the planet, and in this too, we are plant-like in that sense, right? And then two more things that, so those were the two factors I think that Hildegard could shed light on from the pandemic itself, and then our responses to the pandemic. In self-isolation, we have become temporarily sessile, right? In the state of self-isolation, we have become temporarily sessile, and it became perhaps even easier to identify with plants in this trajectory of the vegetalization of existence that I follow and that Hildegard, I think, follows as well. But it also turns out that we have long roots and shoots that are technological. And so that the projections of our images, voices, thoughts, as is happening now, can go far and wide thanks to communication technologies. It turns out that the world is already vegetal in this, again, interconnectedness that has been framed only technologically, just as it has been framed only in the spiritual, perverse spiritual, financial sense before in globalization. It turns out that there is a vegetal element to this interconnectedness. The world is already vegetal, and we have just not come to terms with it. Perhaps this pandemic is an occasion to do so. And finally, the final thing we can learn from our responses to the pandemic is that there are multiple senses of movement. There is obviously movement from place to place that has been severely restricted under the current conditions, but there can be also lots of movements in place by rooting and growing and decaying in the same place. So that through an imaginative relation to a place where we are, we can dwell in that place and be indwelt by it. And in that sense, we also, even in this political and individual response to the pandemic, we can also see something of the vegetal in ourselves then.
Excellent, Michael. These are really inspiring thoughts for us to end on. There's a number of things to articulate and to move forward with. For instance, the idea of finding nature against nature within nature, something very inspiring. Also, the co-sounding of the world, and especially our implicated understanding of the mental, psychic, spiritual capacities of the human and the world's material, extended, embodied relations. A final question regarding the title of this year's edition of Ripoca, and Suddenly It All Blossoms. So thinking through Hildegard, can you envision a blossoming at a global or planetary scale?
Yes, definitely. I think that I made it clear that for me, in my reading of Hildegard, spirit and matter stand respectively for theology and ecology. So I'm really trying to get certain snapshots, I would say, of Hildegard's ecological theology, and at the same time, what we call spirit and matter, what in the tradition has been called spirit and matter, are not things, are not entities, but practices and disciplines that hone, cultivate, and indeed activate what is called spirit and matter. And if we were to treat them as entities, then they would be just, again, ideal entities, no matter how much we profess our commitment to materialism and new materialism. It would turn matter and spirit into things and not active practices. I've chosen to focus on St. Hildegard's works because it seems to me that her practices were inherently spiritual material. They were, and therefore theologico-ecological, right? And that should be our model today of how to renegotiate and rethink and re-embody this complex, difficult relation between matter and spirit. I'm not sure that given the state of the world and of the earth today, we can already envision a blossoming that the event is so admirably alluding to, even if such a healing integration were possible and if it were undertaken. At best, we might start, I think, preparing the ground and the soil for blossoming, which if we look at what happens in the vegetal world, blossoming temporarily puts an end to vegetative growth, rechanneling a plant's energy toward putting forth flowers, right? And so blossoming, to my mind, will have to wait for flourishing to reestablish itself. In other words, everything will first have to flourish and to finally reconnect with another kind of growth than a simple qualitative increase, and then blossoming will finally be possible.
Thank you, Michael.